Hey, welcome to my ICOM seminar. I'm going to be talking about this idea. We've been doing this for years, diaspora missions and social media. If you don't know me, short story about me, my name is Dave Jenkins. My family, we were missionaries in East Africa for 19 years. And 8 years ago, we moved back to the United States and we've continued to serve East Africans as missionaries. I spent 7 years in Chicago and 1 year in North Dakota. And this is something I'm going to kind of walk you through my thought process, things that I've learned, things that I've observed, and hopefully give some guidance for how you could be supportive or you could join this. First thing I want to do is kind of talk about something that's really, really old. When I was in undergraduate, working on my Bible degree at Harding University, and this would have been in the mid-'80s, I remember Van Tate, which was one of our missions professors, put a book in our hands called Missionary Methods, St. Paul's or Ours. It was written by a man named Roland Allen. And I just dug it up myself. Every couple of years I reread it, and it was actually written in 1912. I was reading it in the mid-'80s, and I still come back and read to it. It's a classic. And if you haven't read it, I hope you do, but let me just kind of throw out, here's the basic premise that Roland Allen had. A lot of times we talk about what would Jesus do, but another question I think we ought to ask is what would Paul do? Because if we're trying to proclaim the message of Jesus and we're working with diverse cultures and diverse people, sometimes we'd be better off to put on our thinking hat and say, well, what would Paul do in a situation like this? I am going to make an observation that I think if Jesus was living in our world today, I think Jesus would be one of those individuals who would clearly continue to share his messages about the kingdom, but I don't think he'd be Twitter. I don't think he'd be on Facebook. I don't think he would be on WhatsApp or Instagram. I don't think he'd be blogging. I don't think he'd be on YouTube. I think he'd just keep speaking it publicly and privately, and others would be writing it down and passing what he said around. However, I think if Paul was with us today, he'd be one of the most active people we would know on social media. He'd be on Facebook, he'd be on Twitter, he'd be on Instagram, he'd be participating in private WhatsApp groups. He would take his best thoughts and he would put it up as blogs, or he'd turn it into a Facebook Live or YouTube, and people would be going to it. Now, I'm going to use a term in this that sometimes people don't use very often, but it's frequently used by immigrant communities. The term is diaspora. And I discovered this term in the late 90s as I was visiting Rwanda, and I was observing that Rwanda's history was a lot of people had been outside of Rwanda due to the chaos of the past. And then in the mid-90s, they began returning home, and those that came back home had not just lived as refugees in refugee camps, they had found opportunities to move up in life, and they returned to Rwanda as professional, well-educated, middle-class people, and they used the word diaspora to describe themselves. And I remember going, I haven't heard that one before. Tell me about it. And people would say, well, if you actually know the Bible, you'll notice that the Jews use this term, and it goes back to the period of the Babylonian exile. And then if you watch history, you'll notice that people who have been scattered but still kept some historic root will use that term to describe themselves. And it usually means people who live really in two worlds. They live in two continents, in their minds, in their hearts, in their resources, in their bodies. In a typical year, live in two countries. Many times they're like Paul, where they'll even actually have citizenship in a couple of different nations, where Paul would say, well, I'm a Roman citizen, but I'm a Jew of Jews. In fact, I'm a Benjamite. Well, that's kind of the process that most diaspora people have. And for those that are believers, they will start to talk about, well, really my nationality, my ethnicity, my passport is only really a temporary document. It's not really permanent. What is permanent is I serve the King of all kings. Well, I got really aware of that, and it was what drove much of our ministry when we were outside the United States. And as 8 years ago my family returned to the United States, it's driven us. And I'm going to say this, practically, if you are a missionary in someplace outside of the United States, 30 years ago, if you had returned to what you said your passport said was home, you'd probably have to leave everything behind. Today, what immigration has done to much of the United States, Canada, and Western Europe is a missionary can be serving overseas and then he returns to what his passport says is home, but the people he's been serving many times are still in the same location. For instance, when we moved from Kigali, Rwanda to Chicago, Illinois, we found that there were about 30 family members of church movements we had been part of that were in Chicago, that were Ugandan and Rwandan and Kenyan. And then the network just grew. And then about a year ago, we moved to Bismarck, North Dakota, followed a surge of African migration. And one of the first things I did was got a hold of the Rwandan embassy because I saw that they had been doing some stuff out here. And I showed up in Bismarck and my network's here. This is what happens. Well, when that happens, some typical things are going to happen. Most of the time, these diaspora communities, a few ethnicities can show up somewhere, and there's hundreds of them in one location. They're going to struggle to adapt a little bit, but they can form a local church because there's enough of them. But sometimes what happens is there's a significant number, but it's not significant enough that you can form a viable local church. You maybe have somewhere in an area like Chicago, maybe you have 1,000 people, maybe you have more likely just a few hundred, but they're mixed in with 10 million. They're kind of a drop in the bucket. They're needles in the haystack to find. In a place like North Dakota, there's enough that you find some that will form small local churches, but even there's a frustration they may have in engaging the Anglo church, and I'm going to mention something I really want to say clear, and it may sound a little bit offensive. Most of our immigrant communities, most of diaspora Christians, when they come to the United States, and if you just kind of say, well, let's look at the numbers, they tend to know their Bible more than the Anglo church leaders. They tend to pray more. If you look at what percentage of income they give to help others, it tends to be more. Their marriages tend to be more stable. Their kids tend to outperform Native American kids in areas like academics, athletics, or arts. So they're culturally not that sophisticated, don't have a lot of power, but they're spiritually, there's more substance to them than most of what they'll find of the people who are leading the traditional Anglo churches. And you have this really unequal balance of power that is going to create some frustrations. And it may create some things where there's not as much engagement, you don't quite know how to work well together. And then you're going to see, okay, where people are most comfortable is this diaspora living of feet in two different places. And sometimes, this has been my experience, those that would be leading an Anglo church or would want to lead a church movement would say, well, we'd like to see you plant churches, won't conceptualize that in these diaspora communities, their fundamental social building block is one extended family. And then if they get together beyond that, it'll be a community organization or a soccer team or maybe a monthly fellowship that is interdenominational or non-denominational. Church is kind of a hard beast to get them in. So they're not numerically sufficient to build a local church. They sometimes get pushed aside and not allowed to sit on the side of the table of making decisions. And they have some complexities where sometimes they're going to be dealing with mental health issues that are driven by cultural adaptation, and they need some place to talk. How does a missionary type person provide spiritual nurture in such a dynamic? I'm going to go back to what I think Paul would do. I think Paul, in such a dynamic, if he had done what we know is, he grew up in Tarsus, and then he lived in Jerusalem, and he became a master rabbi, and then he's traveled around as Saul of Tarsus, and he was converted, and then he went back to Jerusalem, and he spent some time in Arabia, and then he got out, first went to Antioch, and then just started planting churches all over. Paul, as he was doing that, he kept writing letters. And kept writing and dialoguing and bringing people in and out and moving them around. I think Paul, in such a situation today, as we have diaspora missions, where people from the global south have scattered into the west, many times don't sit on the side of the table where they can provide leadership or are not numerically strong enough or numerically big enough that they can form their own local churches, they would start to use social media as the bread and butter, just like I think how Paul would do it. They'd be on Facebook, they're on Twitter, they're on Instagram, and they would go privately on WhatsApp. And I think Paul would do blogs, he would do Facebook Live, he would do YouTube frequently, and I think a lot of times immigrant churches are doing that. Here's what I'm seeing is happening in my networks. I see that a lot of missionary types who have returned to the United States and have tried to figure this baby out, and a lot of ethnic pastors have tried to say, can I get a local church off the ground? And it's floundered. It really didn't flounder because the people were spiritually immature, because they didn't know Jesus, because they weren't discipled well. It floundered because there weren't enough people to develop stable attendance, enough resources, and in some ways enough authority structure that you could build things. And many of these local ethnic pastors or missionaries just cannot justify the time and financial commitments for how inconsistent a local church is. So what many of them have done is they turn to social media platforms, and that provides a place to proclaim the message and help people adapt. Some of those things will be very public, like you'll see them on Facebook Live, or you'll see them in Facebook conversations. Some will be very private. There's a social media platform that many are not fully aware of called WhatsApp. It's encrypted. And I'm on a number of different WhatsApp groups. And they tend to be the private groups where small groups, and I'm saying small, sometimes it's 5 people, sometimes it's a couple hundred. But it's usually people who have some basis of community, communicate privately about a lot of things. I think Paul would be in there, and I think a lot of our ethnic pastors are. What you'll notice if you're watching these guys do it is they're going to alternate between photos and celebrations that cultivate a sense of following, such as you're going to see them, oh, here's my wife and I on our wedding anniversary. Here's my daughter at her graduation. Here's the accomplishments of my son playing soccer. And you start to get the sense of this is a family that has a lot going on. They're busy and they're active and they're doing well in life. Occasionally you're going to see them explain some things that are quite painful. They'll be mentioning death or loss or things they're praying for. But they'll be doing something that I think is quite Pauline, where Paul said, as he wrote, he said, follow me as I follow Christ. They'll use their social media platform to lift up a life that is full of joy and thanksgiving and celebration, even when they are culturally confused. Then you're going to see them do something else. You're going to see them start to push into the dark spots of culture. And I thought of one thing also I just want to add. A lot of times these senses of celebration, like I was on 2 groups over the last few months where an older gentleman who was 80 turned 80. Then a few months later, his wife turned 70. And they had done really well in life. They had started off as refugees in Rwanda and in Uganda and came to the United States and then ended up doing well enough as students. They ended up developing an academic career, and they had 4 girls, and the girls did very well. And then the old man and the old woman returned to Rwanda and Uganda and became big leaders there in the academic world and with government, but their kids kept being scattered, and they had nieces and nephews, and they were just scattered. So when he turns 80, we have 100 of us in a Zoom meeting on a multiple of continents, a multiple of different countries, all celebrating how God had been through this, families. But it was just a fantastic experience. This is the type of thing Paul would be doing. Well, these things are happening, many times, if I can say this, diaspora community scattered. You can't get enough of them together to form a local church. If they can have some engagement with a local church, the power structure is really not just, and they become somewhat frustrated with it. So the place they frequently will turn is social media. If you're watching, you're going to see some things. You're going to see that they will show the best that they have, but then you're going to start to also observe some of their perspectives. Now, if you're a missionary person, you've been overseas and you're thinking, well, I'm going to return to what's home, my encouragement is find your diaspora people, keep serving them, don't stop being a missionary. If you're somebody who's living in one of these global south countries and you're immigrating to the United States right now, I'd say, yeah, make sure find your community, help them out, join the associations, don't be anonymous, and stay active on social media because you've got a message that needs to get out. But you might be watching this as somebody who's like typical of maybe you're on a missions committee at a local church, maybe you're an elder, maybe you're a deacon, maybe you're a treasurer, and you're going, what's this thing going on? And how come I can't see all these people just in my local congregation? and you're kind of confused by it, I want to say something that I hope you will hear. I think that we need to, in some ways, flip our paradigms and be willing to those of us who represent the power structures of the American church recognize that there's a lot of things the global church has to teach us. One of the things that I noticed was as we went into this season of COVID and pandemic and lockdowns, I would be watching local churches struggle to know how to do this. And I thought, you know what? The global church has, for a couple of years, been far ahead of the curve. Their leaders have figured out how to keep a sense of community, how to get good communication out there by using social media. And I'd say watch their best guys and follow them, imitate them. Follow them as they follow Christ. Something else I want to encourage you to do, if you're somebody who is typically in a position of authority at your local church, and then you're watching an overseas missionary or who's returned to the United States, or you're watching a local ethnic pastor have conversations on social media, I'm going to ask that you try to learn from it. Because one of the things you're going to start to observe is if you're paying attention, you're going to start noticing global Christians assess North American Christianity very differently than how North American Christians assess it. For instance, and this may sound harsh, the global church will generally see that there is a very significant problem with race in the United States. And in fact, if you get them talking about it, they'll say it's as bad as idolatry in other countries. It's deep, it's entrenched, it needs to be confronted. And they'll talk about it. And it will require, for those of us who are used to being in control, for us to listen and accept the assessment of others as accurate and true, instead of trying to hop in and provide a political correction. You'll also notice some things like the global church will look at how the North American church looks at life. And they'll say that the local church many times is flippant in how it looks at life. And one of the obvious things has been they'll be puzzled when they see a local church start to make arguments about religious liberty while there's vulnerable people in their midst through the COVID season. The global church will say, we've always protected life. We've always given up our rights. Let's give up our rights so we can protect life. The global church also, if you listen to them, you'll just even notice in the pronouns they use. It's rare to hear a global church leader use the pronouns I, my, or me. And you'll notice if you see a global church leader, somebody who's got a diaspora or an immigrant base, start to use the pronouns I, my, or me frequently, somebody in his community is going to come in pretty quickly and correct him. You'll see that the global church will use the pronouns us, ours, and we. And they'll be constantly thinking, how does my action fit within a community? How do we lead as a group? And they'll see a couple of things theologically. They will talk about the triune God. They will understand the community that's part of the Godhead. And they will understand intuitively what community looks like for those that follow God. Let me close with that thought. I want to encourage you, as you're listening to this, to say, hey, there's something that's happening in the global church. It has immigrated to the United States. It has immigrated to Canada, to Western Europe, and it's come in a different form. Many times the form it's come in has been fitting in the word, this old word diaspora, and people keep living in several different worlds. As they do that, many times the first assumption of Anglo church leaders is, well, form local churches, but some locations there's not enough people to form it. In other locations, the power structure really doesn't give them a voice on the side of the table of making decisions. Then you're going to start to watch that the global church, the diaspora, many times do the bulk of their community and the bulk of their communication online. They'll be active on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Zoom. They'll be blogging, they'll be YouTubing, and if you pay attention, you can see what's happening. My encouragement is, if you're one of the categories of an overseas missionary or you're an ethnic pastor immigrating, stay in that game. Keep working with social media. It's the bread and butter. Paul would do it. And if you're someone who's relatively new to this, but you want to be supportive, be supportive. Financially support the missionaries who do this. Financially support the local church leaders, the ethnic pastors. listen to them, learn from them, and be very slow to offer correction when they're dealing with complexities that are far, far different than the understanding of the American church, and their perception is likely more accurate because it's representing thousands of years of history, lots of Bible study, and the cultural adaptation that happens when missionaries come to new places. Thank you for listening to me. God's blessings upon you at ICOM.